I'm Johnny Cash. Just kidding. I've always wanted to say that, though, so I figured today would be the day. How's everybody doing today? Doing good? Yeah? Some of you guys are like, just get to the message, man. Like, this is me getting my coffee. You guys don't go straight to work when you get there, so I'm taking my time, right? So, my name is Nick, and Pastor Jeff called me about a week and a half ago and asked me if I would fill in for him. And I said, absolutely, 100% yes. And he then told me that his father-in-law was going to be preaching this last week. And so I got the chance to listen to him, and he said he was really impressed with Pastor Dennis and the way that he preached it. So I thought, I drive for a living, and I get a chance to listen to podcasts and stuff. So I listened to Pastor Dennis before last week, and I thought, wow, I get to follow Pastor Jeff, and then I get to follow Pastor Dennis, both of which are phenomenal. So I told my wife, I said, this is like if I were a magician, I would be following David Copperfield and Chris Angel. And my wife said, well, I guess you just have to be Houdini. And I said, I can do that. I will get up, introduce myself, and find a way to escape. So I talked to Pastor Jeff, and I asked him if there's any direction he wanted me to go, and he said, just wherever God takes you. And he said, you have 4 hours to do it, so I hope you guys have cleared your schedule. Not really. I'm usually a pretty quick preacher. I'm a guy that tends to have word economy, and I get to the point fairly quickly. I say that, but then the message may run long, so who knows? It's up in the air. So anyway, last week, Pastor Jeff 2 weeks ago started talking about a spirit-filled life and what that looked like, and he's going to continue that when he comes back. That was a great message. If you haven't heard it, I suggest you go online and listen to it. Last week, Pastor Dennis talked about taking the ordinary and using it for the extraordinary. And this week, I get to preach about one of my very favorite stories in the Bible, and that is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It is my favorite story because of 4 little words, and we'll get to those here in a little while. So I think that often we get caught up in the miracles of the Bible and the stories that come with it. We get caught up in the miracles that are done for the characters in the Bible. But we miss what they had to go through in order to be on the receiving end of that miracle. Like I said, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3. So if you want to turn in your Bibles there, you can get there. We're going to read all 30 verses. Is it okay to read the Bible in church today? All right. All right, so chapter 3, it says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide and set it up in the plains of Dura in the province of Babylon. So the reason he's setting this up is if you go back a couple of chapters, he called all his people together to interpret a dream that he had. But they didn't have to just interpret the dream. They had to tell him what he dreamt as well. He said, tell me what I had a dream about, and then tell me what it means. Pretty impossible task. And if you don't, you're all going to die. And so none of his people could do it. So then they summoned Daniel, which this is who this book is about. And Daniel said, look, you had a dream about a statue, and the head was made of gold. The body was made of silver, the legs were made of iron, and the feet were iron and clay mixed together. Well, Nebuchadnezzar's a lot like Donald Trump, so he just heard gold, and he was like, I got this. So it's not a political message, I promise. It's okay to laugh. So that's why he built this statue. So he then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. That's basically all his leaders. And so we go on to verse 3. It says, the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. He wants you to know that everybody around is in attendance. It's not just the Chaldeans who Nebuchadnezzar was leading. It's everybody. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, harp, pipe, and all other kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So when the band strikes up, you go face down. He said, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the fiery furnace, the blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the band and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold." As if they have to tell King Nebuchadnezzar what he just proclaimed, right? But they're reminding him that this is what was said. He said, whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you. For your majesty, they neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. My question is, how did they see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not bowing down if they were face down as well? These are just thoughts that come to my head when I'm reading. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up now?" So he's given them an opportunity to say, look, these people are liars. Yep, lost my place. Okay, here it is. So now when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I've made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to save you from my hand. So he's kind of spitting in the face of the Jewish God. He said, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand." And these are my four favorite words. Even if he doesn't. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. I was talking to a friend about this upcoming sermon, and I was telling him, I said, that's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Those are my four favorite words, even if he doesn't. And I said, because, he talks about, we're not going to worship you, and we're going to be saved. But even if we're not, we're still not going to worship you. And my son overheard this conversation. He says, well, yeah, they'll be dead. And so I was like, that's a good point. But they'll be with Jesus, so we don't have to worry about that. So then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, commanded some of his strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. Men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." Well, he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the god." Isn't it interesting that the fire was so hot it burned the people that threw them in there, but not them? And what he is amazed at is that there's another person in there. The things that stick out. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." They trusted to him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. No other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. That is your Bible lesson for today. Congratulations. So then I asked myself, well, what can we learn from the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? And I think that there's three pretty obvious things that we can learn from them. And so I'm going to kind of go through that a little bit. Most scholars believe that the fourth person that was in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was a Christophany. It was Christ coming down to be with them. And so I think that the first thing that we can learn is pretty obvious, and that is that it's easier to stand for what you believe in when you're doing it with other people, right? See, we were never, ever meant to do life alone. We were never meant to walk in this world by ourselves alone. I work, I go in at midnight, and then I get off about noon, and so I sleep during the day when everybody else in the world is awake, and I'm waking up when everybody else is going to bed, and it can be rather lonely. And so, but God's design was for us to do stuff in community. Matter of fact, in Genesis, he says it is not good for man to be alone. And a lot of people think, oh, yeah, you're talking about groups, and we need to get into groups. And I would say that that is just a starting point. That is something that can get you there. What I'm talking about is an actual community of people that you're doing life with. You're living life with them. We are a body of believers. Christ, the Bible talks about us being a body all the time. And as we come together, we're a bunch of body parts. And when we get together, we become the body. And when we leave, we're just a part of the body. And so when we're by ourselves, a hand laying there by itself is not very useful. Matter of fact, I was with my son the other day, and we were at a store, and there was this mannequin, and the hand was just laying there. He's like, "Hey, Dad, you want me to give you a hand?" And yeah, he's got a lot of dad joke practice already, so he gets it from his mom. So I would say that another lesson that we find is that God is always going to be with us in the fiery furnace. God is going to be with us as we walk through the troubles and the suffering of our life. See, we were never, ever promised to have a good and easy life. We're blessed in America to have a pretty good and easy life, but we were never promised that. But what God did say is that he would walk through that valley of the shadow of death with us. Tells us that in Psalms. And so it tells us that we are going to have troubles. We're going to have problems in this world. As a matter of fact, there's this small character in the New Testament that said that you will have troubles in this world, but you can be confident that I have overcome the world. Just a small little character. His name was Jesus. There's not much written about him in the Bible, but you can probably find it if you search. We also know that he's going to use all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And we can take comfort knowing that even if God seems silent in our suffering, that he's still with us. And sometimes, just sometimes, he's using our suffering to set us free from the things that bind us. When we look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we look as they were being thrown into the fiery furnace, that the only thing that was scorched was their binds, the ropes that tied them up. That was it. That was the only thing that burned up. Not a hair on their head. I'd like to grill, and I get my grill really hot, and then I clean it, and my hand is really close to that flame, and it burns all the hair on my hand. So to say that they had no other kind of scorch marks, no other kind of burns, not a single hair on their head was burned is pretty amazing. It's pretty incredible. So Nebuchadnezzar actually made it a law that everybody had to worship him and bow down to him alone. And if, in doing so, he made it to where it would be illegal for the Jewish people to worship their God, the one true God. But when old Nebi decided to throw the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, God was able to show off his great and wonderful power. Sometimes, so many times, the first thing we do is, God, just save me from this. Get rid of it. I don't want it. But what we should be praying for is that God shines through it. Say, look, God, you have all the power to do this. You have all the power to get rid of my suffering. You have the power to get rid of my pain. But even if you don't, I know that you're still God, and I'm still going to worship you. God, I just pray that you shine through the suffering. I pray that you shine through the pain. I pray that you shine through the hard times. So now we come down to the 4 favorite words in the Bible is even if he doesn't. So how did they get to that point? I asked that question. I'm like, well, you don't just start off there. How did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get to the point where they were like, look, we're going to worship God, and he's going to save us, but even if he doesn't, it's going to be okay. We're still going to worship him. So many times we look at it. How could they say this with such confidence? Well, it starts small. I'm certain that as good Jewish boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were told stories of the Exodus. They were told how God had rescued them from Egypt, how God had parted the Red Sea, how God had taken them out in the desert, given them manna. I'm sure they were taught that as kids. That's pretty standard teaching for the Jewish culture. I'm sure that they learned all the stories that come from the book of Exodus and the miracles that are throughout that book. I'm sure that they learned about all the plagues that were given to the Egyptians. But when we look at the first chapter of Daniel there, we also see that their faith walk started with something small. Because in the beginning, they were supposed to eat meat that was sacrificed to gods. That was against their rules and their laws. It was against the law in their culture to eat meat that was sacrificed to other gods. And so when that happened, they said, look, we're not going to do that. And they had this big argument with people, and they said, look, we're not going to eat that meat. Just give us vegetables, right? And when you give us vegetables, if we don't look as good as the people next to us, after 10 days, then we'll go ahead and eat that meat. So they ate the vegetables for 10 days, and they were nourished. And they looked just as nourished as those that ate meat. And if you don't think that's a miracle, try being a vegetarian. Faith is a muscle, and it requires us to work it out in order for it to grow. You cannot build muscle without strenuous exercise, and you cannot build your faith without strenuous suffering. I think we're often given such a watered-down sense of what it means to be a Christian. We're told that when we come to Christ, everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be great and wonderful. Apparently nobody read what happened to the apostles or anybody else throughout Scripture. We tend to look at the stories of the Bible like a Disney show. Every time, we only remember the happy endings. But there's a lot of suffering that comes with that throughout the whole show. Every told, it ended up with God pulling them out of the fiery furnace, and then everything was good. They went back to their lives, God saved them, and it was great. But when you continue to read on, we learn that they were saved, and then they were sent back to being slaves. That would suck. God, you saved me, and now I got to be a slave. Oh, they were promoted, but now you're just the head slave in charge, and so that means you're responsible for everybody else. So how did Pastor Jeff put it a couple weeks ago? He said, we're saved, but we're still swimming through the sewer, right? So we are still here. But the good news is that Jesus is with us in this muck. He's leading us to better water. We can strengthen our faith by going through difficult times. We can allow God to shine through them. And Nate's going to come back up. And if you have any dealing with, I encourage you to come to the altar and to just pray to God and say, look, God, I know you have the power to save me. I know you have the power to rescue me from this. But God, even if you don't take away my pain, even if you don't take away the suffering I'm dealing with, God, I want you to shine through it. The first step in that is knowing who Christ is. The first step in your faith is knowing who Jesus is. And if you don't know who Jesus is, I beg you to ask somebody around you, to ask one of the pastors on staff. You can come talk to me. Talk to somebody. I'm going to let him play for a while and open up the altars for you to come and just pray, to give your suffering